Conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number, tape number 497, and it's June the 14th, 1981. The most part of this hour will be on part 3 of the Italian scandal, the P2, called Propaganda Due. The Mason, the Grand Masons, the organization was a cover for something different than what the original Masons were intended. I'm going on to that. I just want to reminisce for one more minute. I mentioned it last week that it's 10 years since I've been on KLRB. The New York Times Magazine section last Sunday had a large article, 10 years since the Pentagon Papers. And it was at that time the Pentagon Papers broke that I began discussing the news at KLRB. And the point I tried to make when the Pentagon story broke was that while it was getting the headlines and was very important, the real story in the country was who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King by 1971, these assassinations, Malcolm X, and so forth. And I made the point, and I still have the tapes and the large reels of the original broadcast going on through 10 years of broadcasting, saying at that time that there are hidden governments and hidden forces behind the politicians that we think we select that move and shake the earth and make major decisions. The Pentagon Papers gave a little view of that, but that was my premise then. And of course, the scandal in Italy coming out right now is the best chance to see that hidden government that has come out for I don't know how long. There have been people behind electoral processes doing sneaky things and assassination teams and terrorism from the right and left, but this is a chance to see how it is funded by the extreme right, while Alexander Haig is giving lectures that the Soviet Union is behind the terrorism in the world. The timing is just perfect to refute what he's saying and bring out some of the real facts as they exist in the case. I do want to say that after the Pentagon story, and I began on this program 10 years ago, 1 year later was the Watergate story. And of course, we have an anniversary just this week in a couple of days, June 17th, when the men were caught at the Watergate Hotel. That was the time when I picked up the telephone and called Bernard Fensterwald in Washington, D.C., an attorney for the CIA, and said, you know who got caught last night? And I've mentioned this on other broadcasts before, but sometimes there's new listeners who do not remember the story, and I always like to repeat this one. I said it's the men that were involved in the killing of John Kennedy. Well, a few months later, it was in March of 1973, Louis Tackwood was at my home. He was the man from the Los Angeles Police Department who left the police department because of Squad 19 that involved E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and G. Gordon Liddy, and they were planning to kill Richard Nixon and put Spiro Agnew into office at the time of the convention in 1972 and blame the hippies and radicals. Tackwood had broken off with that group, and I contacted him and got to know him. And he was at my home, and he got a phone call. Get out of there. There's a contract on your life. Leave Monterey right away because James McCord is going to spill the beans. And I gave Tackwood some money. We scrounged around and got as much as we could late at night. And he split and left the house and was in safekeeping until the story really broke, when the next morning James McCord went before Judge Sirica and said the whole gang are lying. It's something different than what they want us to say. And then he appeared at the Senate hearings, the Watergate hearings, with Bernard Fensterwald as his attorney, the gentleman I'd called months earlier, and they had threatened to burn every tree in the forest if the Watergate defendants tried to blame it all on the CIA, that it was something altogether different. And again, that was that hidden government that I had talked about a year earlier on my first radio program, and the story I wrote on Watergate was about that hidden government. In the summer of '74, in an article I wrote on the Senate Select Committee's part of the cover-up, I said that if Martha Mitchell and Louis Tackwood and William Sullivan of the FBI were allowed to testify, 3 of the 4 people that I mentioned in this article, the whole truth of the hidden government would come out. Now, the story in Milan and Rome, Italy, the scandal going on now, has been known to the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and all the Western countries, Spain and France, who are all part of this secret team for a long, long time. And it was only because of missing millions of dollars and various scandals all coming together at one time that the home of Mr. Jelly was searched and the list of the members of the secret society were obtained that I've talked about for the last 2 weeks. And more information was obtained by the authorities in Italy, and now it is beginning to spill out. This is not only Italy's Watergate, this is our story of secret teams that have never really been laid on the table and exposed. And now maybe with the French government going socialist with a large communist support tonight, people will not be so afraid of thinking of alternative ways of handling the economy as if it's so fearful. Maybe they'll learn to live with social changes. The first thing that Mitterrand did when he came into office was to say, I'm going to raise the minimum wage. The first thing Ronald Reagan said was, I'm going to lower the minimum wage. And I believe that England will be scared as France is socialist and Italy has to change now from the secret fascist United States CIA money linked with mob money that is totally breaking the country into extreme poverty and corruption. So maybe they'll change too. I might say on the 10th anniversary of being at KLRB and the 9th anniversary of Watergate that KLRB and Mae Brussell seem to be pretty good survivors. Bob Trevor was pushed out of his news slot at KGO, and he was the only somewhat halfway decent or liberal person up on that station. Bob Fass was kicked off of WBAI in New York because of the challenging information that Bob and I shared for many years, and they played these tapes on BAI. The Berkeley Barb collapsed, the LA Free Press collapsed. In the past 10 years, the alternative presses all over the country folded. Quezon in San Francisco sold 2 times. The Realist, Paul Krasner's paper, folded. The Peace and Freedom Party is just about collapsed, and the Women's International League for Peace is nothing but a few people getting together occasionally. All of the people that were strong and had reason to remain strong, they certainly had the ammunition and the information for 10 years, should have stayed with it in the battle constantly, for whatever reason, folded. But I've been going 9 years and starting my 10th on the air, and KLRB is going good. And I think it's great that there was this constancy and consistency in following events in a chronological order as they unfolded. Now, before I get to the Italian scandal again and continue where I left off last week, I have a problem because as the news gushes out on this matter, and I want to keep you up on it, there are other important events taking place. And I think I may have a form of a newsletter in addition to subscriptions to the tape or the sheets that go with the tape cassettes. I have 2 full pages of legal-size information of important stories, such as I ran off for you last week, and I'll go through them real fast. I don't want you to lose track of these stories, and if you want the sources of the newspapers or the dates, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope with 10 or 25 cents to cover the printing at Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. Send it to my P.O. box there, and I'll send these sheets with you for those of you studying the events as they unfold, because I won't have time to cover them on the program this week, or maybe in the weeks to come when there's so much news, I'll have a separate sheet for you. I'll just run down real fast some of the topics. One is a Wall Street Journal article this week on apparent horrors cloud the U.S. white paper on Reds in El Salvador. The United States gave $25 million to military aid, $40 million to the junta for economic assistance to find out that the State Department, CIA are all lying, and that they had unsigned false documents as excuse for throwing our military aid into El Salvador. This is what we did in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin. And if you don't keep appraised of each of these, you get sucked in and are part of a bloodbath, exploitation of native population based on liars in the Pentagon. Another set of articles are the important connections of murdered Roger Wheeler, the Telex Corporation head in Oklahoma. And there's several articles, one from the New York Times of his links to the Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago in 1973, and references to the Final Conclave, a book on the Michael Sindona Vatican Republican Party, links to the Continental Bank at the same time, and references to New York Times articles by Jeff Girth, who writes about organized crime, and the interlocking links of the Republican Party to the Mafia and the CIA, the private fronts that I mentioned last week, that were owned by Mr. Wheeler. They're simply front door operations. Very possible that his being hit with a contract killer at this time has more to do with the Sedona Vatican international scandal going on in Europe that is going to affect this country, and many wealthy people as well as the lower operatives will have to be wiped out. There's an article on altering of medical evidence after assassinations. Why does the medical evidence change long after the assassination evidence is in on prominent people? This is from the New York Times, and it obviously is because the original stories of where the wounds are not consistent with the final conclusion of where the patsy was. Therefore, the autopsy doctors change the medical reports. They can't change the bodies. There's articles on the Dominican coup that was planned in May of this year, and Robert Vesco has disappeared. There was one article or news account that this coup was to arrange a place for Robert Vesco. The coup was stopped. It was arranged by men in Toronto and Canada, the CIA, an ex-police chief of Oklahoma City, officials from Kansas. They had a Nazi flag that they were flying on their ship. It was for international gambling with an international airport run by a former Kansas police chief as well as one from Oklahoma, a Nazi by the name of Wolfgang Droge, another one of those crazy names from Forsheim, West Germany, organizer of the Canadian Knights of the Klan. Droge worked in Alabama, another Klan member from Washington, D.C., Joe Hawkins of the White Knights of the Klan. This Robert Vesco connection is interesting because if the island was for him and these Nazi from all over the United States and Canada were part of the operation, Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for Robert Vesco, is, as I said several weeks ago, also the attorney for John Hinckley Jr., who mingled with the Nazis in these cities and states around the country. And was John Hinckley Jr. to get protection, say if he escaped, or if he's let out on mental disabilities? And Robert Vesco has been linked with assassination teams, mafia, drug connections, and also pilfering off about $224 million that he never had to account for from the investment overseas operation. There are also interesting articles, again, about the news leaks from the State Department, because Haig may use that again at a time where he is under the gun because of his links to the Italian Celio Gelli, this Nazi with dual citizenship in Argentina and Italy. I predict now that Haig and Reagan will fall from this disaster that is sweeping around them, but Haig will desperately need those wiretaps again, and I think he'll use the news leaks in Washington. There's also an interesting article by Alexander Cockburn in the Wall Street Journal on Israel and the effort to discredit Jacobo Timmerman. That's the man who wrote a new sensational book about the Nazis in Argentina and his tortures there and how Jews are tortured in Argentina. And Israel is putting down Timmerman for some reason, and Cockburn can't figure out why. If he looks closely at Israel, I believe the biggest rip-offs of our entire generation are Menachem Begin, Germany's Henry Kissinger, and Simon Wiesenthal. I believe they're sick traitors. I think that Israel's more aligned to the people they do the most trade with, which are South Africa and Argentina. I've said for a long time that Israel is not a country. It's a landing strip for U.S. armies, and I don't even want to spend time talking about the bombing of Iraq. Read your papers and take it from whatever place you want to see it. I don't think of it as a country, and I think of Begin working with Nazis from World War II, and he will destroy Israel, and they're just biding their time until they're wiped out. That has always been my opinion of the people running Israel, and every day it seems to be more true. One other story that was important, Washington Post, June the 14th this week, on Frank Terpil and George Korkola and Edwin Wilson. Those are some of my favorite fellows. These are FBI tapes describing their arms dealing, their views of the CIA, of international terrorism funded by the right wing. They tested poisons in Beirut restaurants with 50 kilos of cyanide. Terpil talks on tapes about sitting at a dinner table with Idi Amin when the head of the prime minister, one of the officials, is on the table, and then Amin shoots holes in it. They lift the lid off one of the serving dishes, and one of the public servants is on the dinner table with his head cut off. They are, as I say, experimenting on poisons. And in lieu of that, there was an article, the Soviets blamed the United States for a fatal epidemic in Spain. This was May 29th, 1981. A viral epidemic was coming, the TASS agency said, from the U.S. military base where 18 died, 1,500 were hospitalized. And we stockpiled our biological weapons in Spain. They were supposed to be removed. There's no guarantee they were removed. And TASS said that this was what was causing the problem outside of Madrid with the mysterious virus. Well, at the same time that TASS said that, Frank Terpil had made tapes about testing cyanide in food and giving it to people in the Middle East in a restaurant to see how it went as a food poison. There's another article in February that I didn't get a chance to talk about. A David Wilson from San Francisco with a complicated background. He was found dead in Milan. He called his wife and said he was coming home. He made the biggest arrest of any seizure of heroin, pure heroin, coming from Iran into Milan. He was murdered in Milan. He was young. He died right after he had phoned his wife. He comes from Atlanta, Georgia, home base, went to Baylor University, a history major at Stanford University. His wife is in the Department of Epidemiology in San Francisco State, where there have been 4 deaths of doctors in the Bay Area in the last several months. I have to update those. He worked for the Justice Department in San Francisco on drug raids with his Baylor, Stanford, Atlanta, Georgia, San Francisco, Milan connections. I thought there was something interesting in the quick way that he died the evening that he was able to find these people. Another article this week on the assailant of the Pope. It was a Washington Post story. Mohammed Agca was trained in Syria as the Pope's assailant. Well, Mark David Chapman, John Lennon's assailant, was trained in Lebanon, and John Hinckley Jr., Ronald Reagan's assailant, was trained in the United States of America. But that doesn't mean that the left of the Soviet Union traded them. The Washington Post, June the 14th, 1981, says Frank Terpil was the man of the assassination teams. The CIA is in Damascus, Syria right now, so there's no reason to believe that the Syrian base where Terpil works isn't the one that could put Agca and his Nazi links all over the world with his German banks and Swiss connections and Viennese connections and so forth. There's no reason to believe that Agca could, even if he trained in Syria, couldn't be in Damascus, Syria with Frank Terpil. The idea that the Soviet Union is doing these training places doesn't make sense, and there is more reason to believe that Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II were killed because of the closing web of the scandal in Italy than there is to think that the Soviet Union would even try to train somebody to kill them and wouldn't even have a motive to do it. Well, now back to the Italian scandal for the remaining of the program, because it is something that you almost need a magnifying glass to find any more of it in the major news this last week. They're hoping it'll fade away. They're hoping members of the United States Congress about to take their summer vacation won't think about it, but with over several thousand papers in the hands of officials in Italy, with the links to the CIA, to the United States, I don't think, even when the members of Congress come back in the fall, they will find that this story has faded. Last week I might have referred to a Los Angeles Times article. There are a few more quotations I wanted to put in on this matter. These were from May 31st in the Los Angeles Times. This writer said, Licio Gelli, Gelli, is certainly an unsavory master. He has a positive genius for intrigue and skullduggery and commands in Italy 963 brothers to do his will. He really must out Manson with 963 of the elite guard of one country in his hand that do his will. The Times says he might have made a good try at overthrowing the country's elected officials. If he had kept going, the P2 Lodge, with Gelli's power base, has been involved in every rotten or horrid thing that happened in Italy, including murders, and I might have mentioned this last week, including the attempted murder of the Pope. So far, he's not listed, but he could be. The article by Henry Tanner says there are links to the criminal underworld and to the right-wing political groups, and those are the combinations that I have mentioned on this station over the past 10 years, that the political parties of the right and left, the Democrats and the Republicans, do have links to the criminal underworld. And everything I'm saying about Italy has its counterpart in the United States. His organization is one that has a contingency to prevent any communist, and they define communists, from coming to power, such as Allende did in Chile. There always is a team ready to murder any person that this group thinks is going too far left. I don't even know how the French got their election through at this time. It's amazing to think how they did it. Now, Jelly operated in secret. He kept members from knowing each other. They worked strictly on a need-to-know basis. They were set up a long time ago. They have no particular meeting place. They're only known as the Elite Lodge, and the Venerable Master, that's Mr. Jelly, has a phone switchboard that puts one member in touch with another, and he fills any request. I mentioned before that a man had called me, this is several years ago on KLRB, had called me and told me that he had worked for the CIA and had killed William Harvey of the CIA and FBI, the agent from Indiana who supplied the poisons and the weapons to kill Fidel Castro for the organized crime team. And he told me how assassinations come down, and I'll repeat it sometime soon for you, on another program where the orders first start in Utah and then go to Chicago and then to go Greyhound bus stations where you pick up your orders. And he gave me a chain of command. Well, this is the way it goes. If somebody has a request, and this is identified for an Italian operation, but it happens in the United States also. You ask Mr. Jelly, you make any request you want. Do you want somebody blackmailed? Do you want him promoted? Do you want him to have a special position? Do you want him to leave the country and get out of town? Whatever. And then he uses his criminal association and the espionage agencies, and having 30,000 files that they admit to on every prominent person, not all lodge people. Most of them are not in the lodge, of course. With incriminating information, they can control their political opponents, and they have it down to a button where they can call and order. Now, Mr. Jelly was in Washington for Ronald Reagan's inauguration party, and I'll get to that soon. And they had asked Ronald Reagan and the Republicans to let Michael Sindona get out of jail. And Mr. Stanfield Turner, former director of the CIA, and Alexander Haig and other military officials wanted Sindona out and testified for him from the CIA and the syndicate and so forth. And that was turned down, and that may be another reason why Ronald Reagan was shot, because Jelly had come here to the inauguration and had put pressure on his contact in Washington, D.C., who was the middleman to Sindona, and met with Ronald Reagan, and Reagan obviously couldn't save Sindona. I read in the paper today that Sindona was charged for leaving the country, that they're adding to his 25 years for milking the bank. Now, the Franklin National Bank. Now, they may have arranged with one of the largest drug dealers and murderers in the United States, this Weiler, to have Sindona on the roof of the Correctional Center in New York, where he was when that airplane came. But it was a failure for a very funny reason. They didn't bring a scissors to cut the wire, or Sindona would have been out on his second escape. So this Jelly picks up a phone and he can get what he wants, and he is part of the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. So the description of him that is in the newspaper is not for him alone, but it reaches over to the United States. And of course, he's an honorary consul for Argentina and has strong links to Italy, Argentina, and all over the world. Los Angeles Times describes him as a mystery, a man of mystery, who has large designs, who maintains his dual citizenship between Argentina and Italy. He's the head of an occult center of power. Now, that's interesting because of the occult links to Nazis in this country of the right that tried to make it look as the left, such as Charles Manson and David Berkowitz and many of our mind-controlled people. They're trying to blame it on occult groups, where actually they were funded and engineered by the extreme right, just as they do it in Italy. What we're seeing in Italy is a mirror of ourselves. If you read your New York Times articles, your Washington Post, the People's World, and even Solidarity, and I'm going into that, you'll see what is the United States. What is coming out in Italy is us. And that is the important part about these broadcasts that I want to stress. That the reason I've been on the air 10 years and done the research is that what is happening there, everything you read about there is here, and it's also in other countries around the world. The machinery is set up. The New York Times article of the 31st of May did say that Mr. Jelly is a part of an international operation conducted by a group that call themselves the Freemasons that is directed from the United States. Now, some people may say he gets his orders from Argentina, or he gets them from Italy, from Sicily, another group in Italy. But the point is that the bulk of the Vatican money is now deposited into the United States in blue chip stocks, and Sedona's money was sent out to Argentina. There is a large transfer of funds going from country to country. It is an international operation, according to Mr. Tanner of the Los Angeles Times, conducted by the Freemasons, directed by the United States and from the United States. Now, People's World had an interesting article this week, and I'm going to quote various sources on this matter. It doesn't matter, as I say, whether you read People's World, which is a viewpoint of the left, whether you read Solidarity, which is right, a labor group, but working with Mitchell Werbel and many Nazis that are involved in this operation. They give you half the truth, but that half is right. Or whether you read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the establishment paper, the Wall Street Journal, every one of the newspapers that writes about this scandal, whether it's the right, left, or middle, is going to have something to offer. And what they have to offer is a piece of the puzzles. Because just as Watergate came down when McCord started talking, James McCord, no matter what you read, whether it was the alternative press, the communist papers, the establishment papers, the system fell and collapsed. The president left, the vice president left, members of the cabinet left, the attorney general went to jail, the top aides went to jail. There was bartering and dealing and 30 to 40 deaths of primary witnesses as soon as it started collapsing, and shredding of papers with this panic, and deep sixing other things in the river, and burning other papers, and emptying out the White House, emptying out the extra guns in the drawers, such as E. Howard Hunt had, and the road maps and the plans for emergency contingency units of overthrowing this country. No matter what you read, and it came from everywhere, it was still Watergate, and the same way with this. Now, the People's World has an article by Mark Allen, dated June the 6th, 1981, titled "The Masons in Rome, Terror, and the CIA." And each one of these stories mentions that the news media is ignoring the significance so far, and they prefer to go into the history of the Masons instead. The people writing large articles are aware of the fact that the news media is sitting on this and probably belching and groaning and wondering, how far is this going to go before we have to take it? According to the People's World, this group in Italy is led by Gelli, which they all agree upon, who constructed a government within a government from the highest corridors of power. He's in control of the economy, the armed forces, the security agencies, the news media, the judiciary, and the organized crime. Again, in the United States, the reason you can't find out about John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy who killed them, or Martin Luther King, or Jonestown, or the Manson family, or any of these scandals that are terrible scandals, is because they're run by the highest corridors of power. The ranks in control of the economy, the Wall Street people, the advertising agents keep you off the major networks, the ABC, CBS, or NBC. The armed forces have an element of training and are behind this. Security agencies such as the FBI, the CIA, and the local police, the major news media, the judiciary, men like Earl Warren on the Supreme Court, will be on the Warren Commission to cover up who killed Kennedy. Earl Warren ran as vice president under Tom Dewey, who was working with organized crime, and Lucky Luciano and Murray Chotiner and the inner team. He puts on that robe with the justice, but he's a crime figure underneath it, and the judiciary, from him down to certain people in the Dallas Police Department at every level, are covering up, and they work with organized crime. That is an important part of it, the determination of the mafia to assist the establishment in keeping the killings going and keep the government from going communist, because organized crime and the Vatican and other institutions do not fare well if there's a communist government. Therefore, they're willing to all line together as one team. The People's World describes many murders that this group were involved in, and since 1974, Mr. Forlani, the Prime Minister of Italy, has sat on this information from 1974 to 1981 for 7 years. He wouldn't release it, and then this March he got the list, and after the Pope was shot, the story began to unfold. I'll do some more. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then we'll go back to this scandal in Rome, which is also the scandal of the United States government.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, I'm going now to 1979 when Michael Sindona, the man who's been put in jail for that $45 million swindle of the Franklin National Bank in New York, and he's wanted in Italy for other missing millions. In 1979, he wrote in an Italian newspaper called Panorama, the United States administration has no choice but to place its hope into Sicily as against Italy. It is essential to separate Sicily from the continent of Italy, where there are far too many communists. Now, the Sicilian separatist movement involves Mr. Gaddafi, the CIA, the Mafia, and Permandex operations and assassination teams. Sindona received support from the United States. He said, in quotes, "I could command hundreds of Picciotto Mafia soldiers, they're called, that have been undergoing training at paramilitary camps." Now, at the end of World War II, the OSS became the CIA, and William Casey, who's now director of the CIA for Ronald Reagan, was in Italy, and he helped set up the what was to become the CIA in Italy, and pulled people out of the Italian resistance movement, 2 of them, and got them to work for him in the fascist organizations. Casey formed and was part of that famous Marshall Plan that closed links with the Mafia, where we poured millions of dollars into Italy and gave it to Lucky Luciano. He was head of Murder Incorporated in the United States and was prosecuted at great length by Tom Dewey, who then released him to let him go to Italy, where he was recruited into our intelligence system. He was a bandit in the United States, sent to Sicily, and then incorporated into the CIA with Tom Dewey and the Earl Warren crowd over in Italy. Now, General Marshall, similar to Herbert Hoover after World War I, had a special fund of $10 million that he started to put into fascist newspapers and fascist funds for the purpose of stopping communism, and this money was to go for any coup or political intervention in case the leftists wanted to come to power. So as soon as the war was over in April of 1945, by 1947, we had put pressure on all the socialists and the resistance leaders and anti-fascists, and every one of them was weeded out of government. Now, that happened in Germany, it happened in the United States, and it happened in Italy. They were just kicked out of the government. So by 1948, the post-Mussolini election, Claire Booth Luce was running, she was over there as U.S. ambassador, the wife of Henry Luce, who had Time magazine, Life magazine, and a large propaganda machine going with the media in this country. And she publicly threatened that the United States would have military intervention if the leftists entered the cabinet in Italy in 1948. There was a coup in 1960, almost a plot by the CIA to put fascist organizations in power. The NATO files were obtained in 1962. That was October 62, a month before Kennedy was assassinated. The New York Times had an article about NATO and contingency plans for Italy, and files of persons to be immediately rounded up to be arrested if there was social unrest. Now, that was 1963, rather, October 63. In November 63 is when we had our coup in the United States, and the fascists literally took power and killed John Kennedy. And there were plans a month earlier in Italy, and the plans for concentration camps were drawn up. The plot was uncovered in 1964 after Kennedy was dead and Brazil was overthrown. They didn't achieve it in Italy, but the plans of the paramilitary police and the commanders were revealed, and they were supposed to throw away their records, which they kept and did not discard. Well, at the time, as I said, when Sedona had his trial in New York City, he had subpoenaed some very prominent people, former CIA Admiral Stanfield Turner, Alexander Haig, and Admiral Max King Morris of the United States military, to speak up for Sedona, to try to get him off of his being put in jail because of his links His defense was, I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency while he was filtering all this money around. Now, another article about the military in Italy, because it isn't making the big headlines. Again, it's like one of those quiet things that I talked about before on KLRB. The New York Times has an article. It must be all of 4 inches long. June 9th, 1981, military tangled in Italy scandal. Now, 130 military in all were named in this list of Mr. Gelli's secret government. And top military officials, I named a few of them last week, 5 of the admirals, 1 civilian, and 4 of the top officials of the military that were forced to resign, and their security clearances have been taken away from them. Well, this last week, the New York Times reported that 47 generals have now resigned because of the tangled mess, and 6 admirals. And the head of the intelligence agency of the Italian Navy, Admiral Antonio Gerasi, has been suspended. And a senator, Mr. Stamiti, was in a Milan hospital under an assumed name. He tried suicide. They said it was a heart attack. They thought it might be a suicide. A member of the Senate, the first known attempted death, there'll be many, many to follow, of this scandal, just as there were in Watergate. So, well, it's just a little article. It adds to what we knew last week, because last week there were 4 military that were told don't have any more security clearance for them because they are a threat to the country and to NATO secrets. And you have to read books like George Seldy's books on sabotage and the plans to take the United States by the Nazis and the fascists that are indeed working in South America. Hitler said, take South America and forget North America. We can surround them and take them later. They're run by liberals and Jews. And so the security clearance is gone, and this week, instead of 4, it's 47 generals and 6 admirals out of 130 that were named. Now, there was another interesting article about a little party in Washington, D.C. Not a big article. New York Times, June the 4th, 1981. And the title of this little article, I like the way the news reads. You could almost get through your newspaper without finding news of the Italian scandal. You got to look through little bits and pieces on lost pages. But page 7 had one article this week, New York Times. Italy is exploring the Sindona link in the Masonic scandal. Well, that's innocent enough. Michael Sindona is in a jail in New York City and charged with his bank, bilking the bank of all those millions of dollars, and Italy is exploring a link. Well, they don't have to explore a link. They went into Gelli's home looking for papers on Sindona, and they have known for years about Michael Sindona and about Mr. Gelli arranging Sindona when he was arrested in New York. He flew to Vienna and Greece and then to Sicily and was kept with members of organized crime syndicate in Sicily until he's taken back to the United States. But when you read on the little print, Italy is exploring the Sindona link, you find something else interesting. It said the Milan, Rome, Florence Paramilitary Commission. It wants to get to the bottom of the affair of Licio Gelli. Now, if Rome and Milan and Florence want to get to the bottom of the Gelli story, they're going to end up with Ronald Reagan in Washington, D.C., and who shot the Pope and who shot Reagan. If they want to get to the bottom, if they really aren't like our investigators who give us a lot of BS like the Jaworski gang, they'll find plenty if they keep digging. The article says the paramilitary group, the commission there, has nearly 1,000 pages that they're going through now, that Mr. Gelli was involved in the fake kidnapping of Michael Sindona. And if you read your news media papers from, and I'll do many shows on this in the next few weeks on Michael Sindona, the New York Times, Washington Post says the left kidnapped Michael Sindona. It wasn't the left at all. It was the mob. It was the financiers. It was the secret Nazi societies. This article goes on, a Mr. Philip Guarino, Guarino, in the United States, a member of the Republican Party National Committee, had corresponded over in Italy with Mr. Gelli, the gentleman that had trained with Francisco Franco and Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and Juan Perón after the war in Argentina. Mr. Guarino in the United States corresponded with Mr. Gelli, and he wrote a letter. This is what he said: the Vatican will not help Sindona. They're mad at the Vatican. Things are going badly for Michael Sindona. The Vatican Secretary of State The Cardinal Casaroli has forbidden 2 cardinals of the Curia, Mr. Gary and Caprio, to give testimony in favor of Mr. Sindona. Well, that's reason enough to shoot the Pope. If you go against those orders, the Vatican was supposed to send or allow 2 people to testify for Sindona, and Pope John Paul II didn't send them, and Sindona's in jail. So Mr. Gelli may not have liked that if you're looking for motives among the mobsters. The article goes on, Mr. Guarino, the Republican Party, was complaining to his buddy, Mr. Gelli, that Sindona in the United States, even though he's up to his ears with this $45 million grand theft, just can't get the Vatican to come to his aid. Now, there were articles and mentioning in the book, The Final Conclave, how Sindona offered at least $1 million to Richard Nixon and Maurice Stans, and that's downright ingratitude for the Vatican to throw you that in election year, and that you don't come to the aid of Mr. Sindona when he's in the clink, or at least let him be rescued another time around. Now, Gelli from Italy writes back to Guarino, I am following the fate of Sindona closely. Have United States Republicans write to Italy, and I'll publish their favorable articles. So members of the Republican Party wrote to Italy on what a wonderful character Michael Sindona is, with his close links to the CIA and Stanfield Turner and the admirals and the mob families and recognized mob families and bank swindlers. So members of the Republican Party wrote to Italy, and then they were published in newspapers. Now, this Mr. Guarino for the Republican Party is in charge of the Division of the Elderly, which is interesting because the Children's Fund of the Vatican, I've done many shows on, and their links to organized crime. They seem to be hiding behind the skirts of the elderly and the children for these double government fascist intentions. These noble fronts serve very well to conceal what they're doing. There were meetings of Mr. Gelli in Rome and U.S. Republican Guarino, and then in the article it mentions that at the time of Reagan's inauguration, Mr. Guarino arranged for Gelli to visit Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and Reagan met with the entourage. Guarino had made the hotel reservations, and it was a little cozy party at the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Keep in mind that Mr. Gelli, the gentleman who was at the United States for that inauguration, with his dual citizenship to Argentina and against Italy, is one of the strongest fascists in the world, with intent to overthrow governments that have the electoral process, and we vote in the person that we want, that they can arrange coups and have mobsters at their beck and call of the mafioso from Sicily and so forth, hitmen, to keep anything left from getting into power. This may explain an article in the New York Times, June the 3rd, 1981, the courtship of Argentina, why the Reagan administration is very favorable to sharing our Navy with Argentina, why Mr. Buckley and others say that Argentina and Brazil are necessary to defend the South Atlantic sea lanes. Now, Mr. Buckley has been assigned a important position along with Vernon Walters, the retired CIA chief and the old general from the Cold War period that worked with Mr. Casey in the OSS and CIA. The Buckley's family, William Buckley, began the YAF, that organization from Germany that came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area that were involved in the Kennedy assassination. The Buckleys have worked with these fascist organizations. They are immediate front. They're wealthy oil people that appear very glib and reasonable. James Buckley was in Congress for a while. He's now on a special committee pushing for recognition of Argentina and Brazil at this time and tankers in the Persian Gulf. But the important thing is, no matter what comes out about the terrorism in Argentina, the Nazis, the torture, the 10,000 missing people, the journalists that have closed up, the labor movements that are closed, no matter what comes out, Mr. Buckley and Mr. Gelli are pushing the Argentine connections, and the Reagan administration, with the same Mr. Casey that was involved with Gelli years ago and Lucky Luciano, this same gang is now begging for a courtship of Argentina. Another interesting article this last December in the New York Post, by a woman named I. Claudia, tells about Frank Sinatra's deal in New York City. Harry Helmsley, the town's richest real estate mogul in New York City, is considering building a $100 million film studio in New York City for Frank Sinatra, and it goes on to the site of the property where it would be. It's part of the 93-acre Penn Central Railroad yards. And then it says Helmsley also is expecting help from other high rollers. The rest of the Penn Central yard is part of a $1 billion housing project by the Macri Group of Argentina. So you have Frank Sinatra putting on the inaugural ball with his links to the mob and to Argentina and these wealthy multi-millionaires giving him great favors. You have Mr. Jelly at the inauguration party with his dual loyalty to the Nazis and Argentine. At Ronald Reagan's administration, close to the Republican Party in the United States and to members of the CIA and mobsters. And you have the State Department pushing the Argentine connections. There are big bucks in recognizing these affairs. Human rights do not count for anything. The name of the game is big bucks, and that's about what it adds up to. These people have control of millions and millions of dollars, and they can just about do anything they want with it. Now, in solidarity, June the 1st, 1981, they mentioned that this P2 force has centers in London and Venice. The P2 is that Italian scandal of Mr. Jelly. I take issue with many of the things that Lyndon LaRoche prints, and sometimes I think he leaves out important elements, such as his 2 full-page articles on the scandal in Rome don't even mention Sindona or the United States CIA or some of the important branches. But some of the things that they have printed in their 2 issues on this are interesting. One of them was a section, the June 1st article, saying it's this P2 force, that propaganda duo, the Mason scandal of Mr. Jelly's, that has its centers in London and Venice. And the article says that alone, they have the motives and the capabilities to carry out the May 13th attempted murder of the Pope and the March 30th attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. Now, sometimes I throw up my hands and say, what they print is impossible, and yet I try to leave my mind open. Why would Lyndon LaRoche or Linda de Hoyos, who wrote the article, say that London and Venice alone have the motives and the capabilities? Because I think of Swiss banks, and I think of German banks and the South American money. But then I began to list certain points, just keeping in mind what they said, and I'll share these with you because I have certain ideas of putting pieces together that maybe they're not off the wall, or maybe we should consider this point that they make. It is a strong point that London and Venice alone have the motive and the capability to do this. Well, if Mr. Jelly can give orders to anyone or any person, can he give them also to Mr. Casey in return for those mafiosa killers from Sicily, the 100,000 henchmen he can deliver? Does he give the orders? Are they giving those orders to our intelligence agents in the United States and around the world? Well, I know that the banks for the Nazis, the money for Agca came out of German banks, but also Mohammed Agca, who shot at the Pope, was in London for 2 weeks. And he told the authorities, not only was in Switzerland and many Italian cities, but he said he got his orders for what he was to do in London. And London is the location of Samuel Cummings, who supplies Frank Terpil and George Korkola and Idi Amin and Gaddafi, and the left and the right, both sides with all the weapons that they need. And Samuel Cummings is the brother-in-law of Senator Tower from Texas, who has covered up, if nothing else, the Kennedy assassination. The Lee and Marina Oswald links to the intelligence agency. But Tower's brother-in-law, Cummings, from London, with headquarters in Monte Carlo, has been part of this international group to put the monarchies on the throne, to arm the world, to turn teams against each other. And Agca was in London for 2 weeks before he shot the Pope, and he says he got his orders from there. U.S. experiments that have taken place in the United States, many of them originally came from London. The Jonestown affair was really conceived. The idea was conceived by the CIA and John Connally and Ronald Reagan's team at UCLA and the Institute of Mental Health and groups in Washington. But the money for Jonestown came when Tim Stone from Stanford went to London, when Terri Buford was in London, when Philip Blakey was in London. The Barclay Bank from London filled up money in Canada. And also many important deaths to the Nugan Hand affair, out of 12 that we've known died, were linked back to London and the London connections. Mark Lane even went to London to write Rush to Judgment. When he left the United States, he wrote his book on the Kennedy assassination in London, with Trevor Roper writing the introduction. And Trevor Roper is the man that lied about the bunker and, I believe, lied about the death of Adolf Hitler and the events that have given these people the muscle since World War II. Why would Mark Lane, a so-called leftist from New York, use Trevor Roper for an introduction to his book on the murder of an American president? As I say, the Nugan Hand Bank that was in Australia, it consisted of money, of heroin money, black money, assassination money. They had branches in 16 cities, but the Nugan Hand was very much involved in London, and deaths of important people in London linked to the Nugan Hand scandal. The Torbett document on the John Kennedy assassination and the Permandex outfit has a lot of tentacles in London, besides Switzerland and Italy. Italy and London were the headquarters. Sir William Stevenson of British intelligence setting up their compound for Nazis in Montego Bay. In Jamaica, the Permandex story and the Torbett document on the combine of these assassination teams has its centers in London. Albert Osborne, who had the school for trained assassins in Oaxaca, Mexico, was a missionary with a citizenship in London. And he was in Canada, and he sat on the bus from United States down to Mexico with Lee Harvey Oswald. And his assassins went all over the world to kill for Permandex. And they indeed had this dual citizenship between London and the United States and Italy, where the Permandex operation was set up, again, with William Casey of the OSS and Clay Shaw, who then went to New Orleans and was with David Ferry and Carlos Marcello, a buddy of Italian Lucky Luciana in Sicily with the gang. The interconnecting webs of the assassination teams that I've studied for 17 years do indeed have a connecting link to the Italy-London combine. So when I read in Solidarity that the Jelly gang has its base, its center in London and Venice, I started to make a list of things that rang true, that maybe I gave too much emphasis, say, to the German banks or the South Americans, whereas the thinking or the brains was actually coming, Credit Suisse and the Permandex group and the London gang coming from there. If you read the book, The Man Called Intrepid, and the stories of the Nazis after World War II in the Bahamas, as I say, in use of Rockefeller Center, it's London and the Torbett document and the headquarters in London. Now, there are unknown factors that we don't know about of funding in the United States for assassination teams. The Wall Street Journal, April the 9th, 1981, Section 2 of the Wall Street Journal talks about Vanderbilt Energy and the John Hinckley family. And this is what it says in Wall Street Journal. After the shooting of Ronald Reagan, the company, this is Vanderbilt Energy, the company's first order of business happened to be an important meeting with a group of European investors in Vanderbilt Energy's drilling program. This was significant because it represented the potential for a steady infusion of money, but it didn't happen to work out that way. They acknowledged, Mr. Hinckley's son acknowledged, that, in quotes, the retreat of the European investors is a disappointment to the company, but the company won't suffer from the unexpected losses as a result. Now, in order to prove or disprove or to think about the statement in Solidarity that London and Venice had the capability and the motive to shoot Ronald Reagan, to shoot the Pope, it would be mandatory to know what foreign investment was going into Vanderbilt Energy the day that Ronald Reagan was supposed to die, or if he dies of a blood disease from the transfusions. Later on, he may do well, and then suddenly he may have a blood disease and be called back in the hospital. Was this foreign money going into the Hinckley family from Mr. Jelly? Was it from the financiers in Venice, their black money? Was it from the London money that started Jonestown? Now, he was going down that week. He was supposed to move to Guatemala. where Mr. Haig was planning a bloodbath for El Salvador and Guatemala. And one of the reasons I believed, or motives for shooting the Pope at this time, was that he would object to that operation, just as he would object to the coup that was to take place in Spain, again, involving Nazis from Argentina, the dual allegiance to Mr. Gelli to Argentine. What money was going into Vanderbilt Energy? You see, why is it so important? They were to have this important meeting with European investors. So the real answer to the Wall Street Journal article, or to some of the mystery of the shooting of Ronald Reagan and the Hinckley family, is this question. Edward Bennett Williams of the CIA, as I said many times on these programs, is the attorney for John Hinckley Jr. Edward Bennett Williams was the attorney for John Connally, who is directly linked to Mr. Gelli and that hidden government, and I'll go into more of that later, the role of John Connally to this Italian government and Claire Luz and Michael Sindona and the CIA. There are direct links of Edward Bennett Williams' office to this ball of wax, and so the unknown factor in this case is who was going to pour money into Vanderbilt Energy at a time when Ronald Reagan was supposed to die. Mr. Bennett Williams is also the attorney for Gulf and Western, and I'll do more shows in the weeks to come on Michael Sindona, Gulf and Western, and the direct investment and involvement with Mr. Gelli and Luciano and that mob. So there's a connecting link of names that I will be using over and over on this program that have to do with past assassinations, with present unsolved murders that I believe were caused by this particular group at the time that the story was breaking. Now, one reason, as I said before, that Alexander Haig was so nervous and got up there and said, "I am in charge, the Constitution told me," was that his life was really on the line. His NATO admirals and generals, his dirty dealing with Fritz Kramer, the Nazi with Henry Kissinger, the betrayal of the United States, I believe, is linked to him. He may be in China double talking, and he was in Hong Kong yesterday talking about the big threat of the Soviet Union. That is all he can talk about, and that's all he can say. And he can threaten to arm China against Russia and sell Taiwan arms against China. He'll travel around, but he and that gang, Casey and Reagan, and their close links to Gelli and the Republican Party and Sindona, will come out if the Italians keep with their list of 1,000 papers and names and pursue this story. Now, there was one other story in the New York Times that was interesting on May the 31st by Henry Tower. He said the Masonic scandal is more serious than any other outrage because it strikes the spine of the political establishment and tells us about Italian society and politics. And I say the Masonic scandal, that propaganda doing, is serious because it strikes to the spine and political establishment and tells us more about American society and politics, and we'll be doing weeks on the interlocking links of these groups to American politics. They said in the LA Times, one cannot understand our system of power if you don't understand that beneath the visible government, there is that government that operates in the twilight kind of sub-government. It is in complete darkness. It's called a crypto government. This is a quotation in Italy. And I say you can't understand the events of the news if you don't recognize that beneath the visible Republican and Democratic Party, both funded by the same group, there is this third dark group that doesn't want an elected democracy. Whichever way the people want to go, they have the arms and the means to overthrow it towards the fascist side if they don't like the candidates or what is said. I'll do more next week on part 4 because this scandal will be evolving. In the meantime, save all of your articles on it. Send them to me if you think I don't have them. And I'll be back with you next week on KLRB. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.